Hi, Circe. Welcome back. We are going to be talking about paper three now. So I'll start as I did with the previous one. Overall, what's your advice in terms of do's and don'ts for this paper?
But I think the same applies. I think take time over the short questions, read the questions really carefully. Yeah, I mean, reading the questions carefully seems to be a bit of a big issue with paper three. I think also the examiners understand that this is the third of 3 2-hour papers. By this stage, you're probably feeling quite drained. Last summer, some of the essays on social action theories in that paper I thought were really weak, and they were getting like 11, 12 out of 20. So I feel like there's a certain amount of generosity on paper three, possibly because it's the third of 3 papers. And we always think about the notional student, exam stress, they're 18, they're young, they've struggled. And I hope this year will be the same, especially COVID wise.
That's nice to know examiners have got a heart. They know
Oh
that
God,
students are going.
definitely.
Yeah, yeah. And
There's
is
lots
it,
of positive marking in sociology.
I was going to say that examiners will look to positively mark, won't they? They're not trying to
Definitely.
take marks off. Yeah, I think
No,
that's really
definitely not.
important. Yeah. And then how does the structure for questions on paper three differ to paper one?
They're the same, 4, 6, 10, and 30 on crime. The difference is the 20-mark question is on theory and methods. On paper one, it's on methods and context. That theory and methods question is quite scary as a teacher because it could be theories, it could be methods, it could be sociology and science. It's a very, very big range of the specification. The only advice I can give is that if the previous year it was theories, probably it's going to be methods the following year. But otherwise, it's a really broad range of possible essay topics. So that's quite tough. I think
Yeah.
it's a tougher paper than paper one.
Yeah. And you've just made me think, actually, teachers often try and predict what's coming up. Can you predict with any accuracy at all?
I think you can predict that what came up last year won't come up.
Right.
The other thing to say, actually, and this is very useful, what came up in last year's AS paper will not come up in this year's A-level paper. This is to not disadvantage people that didn't take the AS.
Mm.
So I also look at the AS papers from the previous year as well. Obviously, it doesn't work with crime,
Yeah,
but with families and with education and methods, that's a useful tactic.
that's it. That's a good top tip. That's a good top tip. And for paper three, are there any particular questions that are done a little bit more poorly than the others?
I think it's down to the wording of the question. So last summer, the question 3 was about working class victims of crime. And lots of students saw that as offenders. They were so not used to
Mm.
thinking about why working class people are more likely to be victims. Even though the item was quite victim driven, loads of students wrote about offending and ended up with 3 or 4 out of 10.
Yeah,
So question 6 is also quite poorly answered, partly because it was a tough question. It was about social action theory, and also because it's the last question and
yeah,
the students already sat 2 2-hour exams.
yeah. Yeah, I think that looking at the wording of the question is really key, isn't it? I think there was one that
Yeah.
came up a few years ago and it said, in contemporary society, and students just wrote about everything they could remember about a particular theory and didn't read that bit. So paying really close attention to what's being asked is key.
Yeah, and actually, I would say that that's really true for the 30-mark essay as well, because last summer we knew in advance it was going to be about theories because we got the advanced information. But the question asked, assess the extent to which crime is inevitable and beneficial. And lots of students just wrote about functions of crime.
Yeah,
And even when they were evaluating functionalism, they didn't evaluate the extent to which it's beneficial or inevitable. And when they put words in a question, they put those words there for a reason.
yeah.
You have to use those words. And I know this is a bit ahead, but I think an A-star candidate is all the way through is referring back to the question
Yeah.
and keeps really on track because those words are there to make students pick out those words from in their answer.
Well, let's talk about that, the A star grade then. So firstly, students often ask, how do I actually get it? So what is actually needed to achieve an A star grade?
I mean, what I would say is, and this is really important, it's all 3 of the papers added together.
Yeah.
So you can do relatively badly on one paper if you do really, really well on the other two papers. You don't have to get an A star across all three papers. Last summer, it was 74%. So I know sometimes schools don't want the students to know how accessible it is, or I might not share that with teachers that don't teach sociology because I don't want them to say, oh, your A star isn't as good as our A star.
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything in particular because it's an amalgamation of all your marks. In terms of the essay, so if I'm thinking about an essay that gets 27, 28, 29 or 30 out of 30, it's really focused on the question. At the end of each section, there's a link back to the question. That's really important. It's got really good contemporary knowledge. So like you were saying, we don't really want to be hearing just about Durkheim. So contemporary knowledge is really important. And the other thing I would say is make sure that the evaluation is linked to the point you've just made. There's a big problem with what they call bolted on evaluation. So you've written something about functionalism and then you just go, Marxists would argue that functionalism is too optimistic view of society. Rather than evaluating the point you've just made, I think those are the key things to do in an essay, 30-mark essay.
Great. Thank you, Circe. And if you've got a big pile of marking in the summer and you're going through hundreds, and the ones that really kind of stand out, the ones that really sort of open your eyes, is there anything that they're doing that you can see they're right at the very top?
I think it's the use of language is important. The way that they make their points. I think it's analysis as well, really explaining well what different sociological studies mean, concepts mean. I mean, the other important thing to say is finish the paper.
Yeah.
Don't run out of time. Make sure that you finish the paper. This might not be an A-star student, but if you haven't finished, write a really quick plan, or say write to the examiner, see my plan. You can get marks for a plan. I've seen as many as 8, 9 marks out of 20 for a really good plan. Yeah, I mean, this morning actually, I was looking at a question from last summer. It was about the extent to which official statistics are social facts. And this student got 10 out of 10. Firstly, he's talking about how Marxists see statistics as manipulated by the government. Gave some really good examples of that through things like poverty statistics, unemployment statistics. And the second part was started talking about Durkheim and suicide, but then brought it back to phenomenology. I mean, that's a hard one to swallow, isn't it? And the social construction of suicide statistics, Atkinson, really good understanding and knowledge of how statistics are socially constructed.
Yeah. If you've got that knowledge, show it off, right?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, the other thing to say is make your writing legible.
Yeah.
It's scanned, it's photocopied, it's sent, it's on a computer. The person marking your paper will like you much more if they can easily read what you've written.
Yeah.
And also, never cross anything out. Because if it's wrong, they'll just ignore it.
Yeah.
If it's right, you will get credit for it.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been in an examiner's meeting before where we've talked for about 10 minutes about whether or not we should allow this answer to have one line through, but actually it can be read.
Yeah.
So the chief examiner was saying we should credit this student, even though they've put a line through it.
Yeah.
So never ever cross anything out.
That's really good advice. That's really good advice.
Even if you think what you've written is silly, the worst thing is that the examiners are going to have a little bit of a laugh, but so what? You're never going to meet them.
Yeah. And going back to what you said, it's positive marking, isn't it? So
absolutely positive marking. Yeah. And I mean, I think students need to know that we might sit for 10 minutes talking about a student. Oh, come on. They obviously did mean this. I mean, I think sociology marking is very positive. If there's anything wrong, it gets ignored. Don't worry massively about how many names you've got. I mean, it is important to have names of sociologists, but it's not the only thing. Theory essays, there's more emphasis on having names. Theory questions, whereas questions which are more about, let's say, social class and achievement, yes, you need some names, but you also need to back it up with the material and the evidence. really, really recent stuff is important. So anything to do with COVID would be great to get in, especially around working class children and underachievement. And the same with crime. If it's a question about white collar crime, let's get Boris Johnson in. We can.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
good.
Nadine Zahawi, let's get him in as an example of someone who committed tax fraud, didn't go to prison.
Yeah,
That's good stuff.
contemporary
And he's in
examples.
politics at the moment as well,
Yeah,
so that's
yeah. No, that's really good advice. Thank you very much for your time, Cersei. I really, really appreciate it.
you're welcome.
Thank you.